So I welcome everybody to our slightly delayed April edition of Zoom Seekers. We had to push it back a week because I was in Bon Air last week. So thank you all for showing up tonight. And we've got what I hope you will find to be not a morbid but an interesting presentation. John Kades, Captain John Kades, is with the LA County. I never get the name right anymore. We sort of modified the name. LA County Department of Coroner Medical Examiner. I think that's what the official name is. And John are you actually head of the I guess you're not head of the investigations unit. That'd be whoever took over for Craig, right?
Right. I'm a captain with the operations division, so I oversee day-to-day operations and forensic support, and part of that includes investigations.
There you go.
So technically, the official name of the department is Medical Examiner Coroner.
Okay. Well,
but,
like I said,
what's in a name? They may switch or flip-flop or abridge it, but it's the same job, same roles and responsibilities.
It's like when people call me Curtis Ken instead of Ken Curtis. What can I say? Same thing. At any rate, I've worked with John since 2003, 20 years, on scuba fatalities, and the idea tonight is we want to sort of give you an idea and an overview of just what a scuba autopsy involves. It's a little different, obviously, than, well, maybe not obviously. It's a little different. It can be a little different than a quote unquote standard autopsy, if there is such a thing. And despite what I said previously in the notes, we do have a couple of cases we'll discuss tonight, and we'll take questions about them and stuff like that. So without further ado, please give a warm Zoom Seekers welcome to Captain John Kades.
All right. Well,
that way we don't have microphones going off and all this other good stuff, John.
Okay.
So it is all yours. Take it away.
Okay. So it looks like everyone can hear me okay. Audio looks good. I presume video. You're all looking at my PowerPoint presentation, okay?
And we see your lovely office.
Okay. Yeah, not much there. There's a lot of what keeps me going here at the coroner's office. But this is official coroner property, or county property, so I've got to be on my best behavior. So
there we go.
Thank you for tuning in this evening. And when Ken approached me and asked me to present to this group, thought I'd dust off an old PowerPoint presentation, kind of a hybrid of public service announcements and things I presented to scuba diving clubs, and also present to scuba instructor courses here in Los Angeles County. Just kind of like to paint things with a broad brush and give all of you an idea of what the coroner is and maybe what the coroner doesn't do per se, and get specifically into some scuba fatalities. I do want to go into some detail on 3 fatalities we had in the past. Interesting lessons learned there. And I think the plan is when we get to the end, we'll go over 3 of these cases and take questions at that point. My bosses and the people I answer to let me engage in this type of activity and make presentations, provided I can give a gratuitous plug for my department and my agency in the interest of educating the general public about your local coroner's office and what we are all about. Because some of our biggest challenges from day-to-day operations is convincing the outside public what we actually can and cannot do. The general public's perceptions of coroner work and medical examiner work is so warped, shaped, impacted by television and movies. So if nothing better tonight, hopefully you get some good takeaways in scuba-related incidences and cases, but at the same time get a better idea of what I, as a public servant, your local deputy coroner, can do for you. And hopefully you'll never have to meet me professionally. So by way of introduction, the coroner's office here in Los Angeles County, what we are is an investigative agency responsible for looking into the cause and manner of any sudden, unexpected, and unnatural death. We get our authority from the government code sections, and basically for the coroner to get involved in a death, it has to be something suspicious, unusual, unnatural, cases of homicide, suicide, drug overdoses, traffic accidents. Those are the cases that automatically get our attention and we take jurisdiction over. However, we will also investigate cases of natural death, or what appears to be a naturally occurring event or disease that caused a death, when we cannot find a doctor to sign that person's death certificate.
John, let me interrupt for a sec. If you think you're screen sharing, you're not. If you're preambling, that's fine.
Okay, can you see my PowerPoint presentation?
No.
Okay.
So go to the screen share again. There we go. Now it's coming.
Corrected.
Now we got it.
Okay. So anyway, that was my preamble to what I was just talking about there. That's our logo. This is what we're here for today. Is everybody reading me now?
Yeah, we got it now.
Okay. So that's what makes up the bulk of the coroner caseload. It has to be a homicide, suicide, drug overdose, traffic accident. It's the unusual, some type of a death where there could be some criminal conduct, some illegal activity, or something where we have a potential to have to go testify in court later. We also, as I said, investigate cases of naturally occurring death when we can't find a doctor to sign that person's death certificate. We call those unattended deaths. California state law says that a attending physician can sign their patient's death certificate if they have an informed medical opinion as to their cause of death, and they have been attending to them within the past 20 days or 20 days prior to the death. Actually, here in Los Angeles County, we've busted that out to 6 months, so that if you being cared for by a doctor within the past 6 months, your doctor can still sign your death certificate should you pass away, and the coroner does not have to get involved. The numbers, when you stop to think about Los Angeles County, they're kind of daunting. We serve a population of just under 10 million. There's a recent article that came out not too long ago. I guess the population in Los Angeles County has actually gone down for the first time in a long time. We've been hovering at about 10 million, and right now we're standing at just under 10 million. But whether we like it or not, every year, 65,000 of us here in Los Angeles County will die. That's a statistical imperative. You would expect to see that from a population of that size, all deaths, including natural disease or unexpected unnatural incidences. 65,000 of us will not make it to the end of the year. Now, I put a couple of asterisks by that statement there because I would be remiss if I didn't go into some detail about what we just went through with COVID and the pandemic, which basically ran from 2020 through late 2021. But on a normal year, we can expect of those 65,000 deaths that are occurring, about 25,000 actually fall under our jurisdiction. That's how many reports we get from hospitals, mortuaries, and law enforcement agencies saying, hey, I've got this dead body here, what do I do now? And interestingly enough, of those 25,000 or so intakes or reports we take usually over the phone, we reject about 10,000 of those. We have that authority here in California. The coroner can decline to take jurisdiction of a death. It's a judgment call, and there's nothing wrong with that. We do it all the time. We can authorize a person to go directly to a funeral home or mortuary without any level of investigation whatsoever, and we do that quite frequently. But that leaves us with about 15,000 cases to actually investigate. That's when we make it official. We will write a report. We will do some level of inquiry. We issue a case number. We take jurisdiction. And from that number of about 15,000 official, reported, investigated deaths, we're only doing about 7,000 autopsies, give or take. So the take-home message for the general public, when you look at those numbers, number one, very daunting. We're very busy, of course, but more to the point, if a death has occurred someplace, chances are the coroner is not going to be involved. if we do get involved, we don't have to necessarily do an autopsy either. A lot of our cases, we will investigate, we will do external examinations, we'll do a CT scan, but we don't have to do an autopsy. Interestingly enough, when families are opposed to autopsy for religious reasons or personal reasons, we usually resolve that to their satisfaction. We work with them. But we're very good at convincing them, you probably need an autopsy, you probably want an autopsy, here's why, and we usually get them to see it our way. However, at the end of the day, if we cannot convince them and we need to do an autopsy, we shall. We don't need their permission, and we are going to move forward and take care of business. So again, looking at those numbers, if you should hear about a friend or family member or acquaintance who has in fact died and you want information about them, you can contact the coroner and find out what the deal is. But statistically speaking, there's a good chance that the person's death is not under our jurisdiction and wasn't reported to us. So keep that in mind. But going back to the 65,000 deaths that we normally see in LA County, the pandemic, of course, was a big anomaly, a big spike in statistics that we had to, deal with. And like coroners and medical examiners across the country, and actually across the world, we were heavily impacted. Interestingly enough, though, COVID-19, the coronavirus, the people who passed away from that disease, it is a naturally occurring disease and technically not under the jurisdiction of the coroner. The vast majority of people who died from COVID were in a clinical setting. Their doctors diagnosed that they had it, and when they passed away from COVID, their death certificates were signed and they got to go to a funeral home or mortuary directly. Most coroners' offices, medical examiners across the country really didn't have to investigate a COVID-19 death. However, here in Los Angeles, across the state of California and other jurisdictions, there are rules and regulations about when a mass fatality disaster occurs, and there was official declaration that we had a mass fatality event. The local coroner medical examiner is required to step in and assist with storage and capacity of all the victims. And that is what we did. And this is kind of what it looked like. This is how a mass fatality incident is handled across the country, and again, probably across the globe. We brought in an additional 1,900 bodies into our care throughout the pandemic because hospitals, funeral homes, mortuaries, cemeteries did not have the capacity. So this is how we solved the problem. Also by bringing in the National Guard, and wasn't that sophisticated. We brought in about 18 refrigerated containers and about 14 refrigerated trucks. It was all about storage and capacity, and this is what it looked like. This is an aerial view of the area we used primarily. This area is still in use. However, we only have about 5 trucks left and about 15 containers left. What we're going through right now is something you don't hear about in the media too much, but the coroner caseload, the death rate across the board is up everywhere. We're not really dealing too much with COVID-19. There are still a few deaths that are occurring in Los Angeles and in other areas, but what we are seeing an increased caseload primarily due to what I refer to as the echo of the pandemic. Here we are in 2023, and what I mean by the echo of the pandemic is we are seeing a higher rate of mortality, a higher death rate, because for 2 years plus, a big chunk of our population did not take care of themselves. They had to go through telemedicine, they weren't getting their medications, they weren't going to the doctor on the regular basis, they were cooped up, making bad decisions, and here we are in 2023, and we're seeing people just their wherewithal is catching up with them. For no better reason than they are passing away from naturally occurring diseases and other conditions. Had they been on their game, so to speak, for 2 years, they probably would be living a bit longer. Then, in addition to that, you double down with fentanyl, which is a huge problem. And now we're seeing something else you probably heard in the news, something called tranq. That's another street drug that's making its appearance, and we're seeing the effects of it. And complicating matters, of course, is homelessness, and the biggest chunk of our population now, the baby boomer generation, is moving up into their 80s, so they're starting to pass away naturally. But the big chunk of our baby boomer population lived a lifestyle of independence. A lot of them didn't get married and they didn't have children, so there is no plan, or they didn't make plans for what happens to them after they pass away. They live their lives under presumption that they're going to have friends or the church step in for them, and they may be dying of natural causes, but unfortunately your local coroner or medical examiner has to step in and act as the mortuary of last resort. So we're seeing just an increased caseload across the board here in 2023. And at the end of the day, what your local coroner or medical examiner is trying to do for you is answer 2 questions. What is the cause of death, and what is the manner of death? And that is why we are a standalone, independent investigative agency. A coroner can perform an autopsy, and that gives you one piece of the puzzle, so to speak, but there's more to it to that. We have to document the person's terminal event. We have to do a comprehensive investigation. Cause of death is usually a medical conclusion, where an autopsy and toxicology helps to solve that question. The second part of it, the manner of death, could this be a homicide, suicide, or is it an accidental death? That's where people like myself, field investigators, are trained to go out there, collect evidence, interview witnesses, take photographs, and give good information to our doctors, who ultimately sign the death certificates and come up with an informed medical opinion as to the cause of death. So those questions that we answer, the cause of death and manner of death, those are informed medical opinions, not proof positive, not beyond the shadow of a doubt. All we do at the end of the day is ask ourselves, do we have enough evidence, or do we have enough information to come to an informed medical opinion? And if we do, we'll say, well, here it is. You can take it or leave it. We are not obligated to convince anybody of anything. We merely have to express an informed medical opinion as to the cause and manner of death. So now let's shift gears and talk specifically about scuba diving and scuba diving fatalities. I like to put this slide up when talking to groups of divers or people about scuba diving, in the sense of, well, how dangerous is scuba diving per se? Now, I put that first bullet point up there at the top, 1 to 3 million active scuba divers in the United States. That is a real generalization, depending on which magazine you read or who you talk to. How many scuba divers do we have here in the United States? And that's a real arguable, debatable, questionable number. And you would have to say, well, what do you define a active scuba diver? Is that someone who's diving on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, 5 times a year? What is considered active? And that's a real subjective question, but I sort of gleaned that number from a number of different publications and opinions, and 1 to 3 million, that's a very broad range. But if you start off with that, just sort of presume we've got at least 1 million people plus who are scuba diving. We know from DAN statistics over the years, we can expect to see about 80 scuba-related fatalities in the United States. I've seen that number as low as 50. I've seen that number as high as 120. It fluctuates. And we know from statistics here in Los Angeles and sort of paying attention to what's going on, we can expect to see about 5 scuba fatalities every year just here in Los Angeles County. And the DAN statistics and the the real researchers that are paying attention to this sort of stuff will tell us that about 40% of all scuba fatalities were due to some medical complication while diving, or some medical event that might have triggered a terminal event, that might have triggered the accident or the incident that put the pieces into motion, which ultimately caused us to turn it into a fatality. So that's across the board for the United States, as far as we know. And what I can tell you from looking at our local statistics here in Los Angeles, that's probably greater than 45%, maybe even approaching 50% now. So we'll get into some numbers here in a minute. So looking at the numbers here in Los Angeles County, I've got pretty good data going back to 1994. How many fatalities have we actually had each year? The reason I don't have anything prior to 1994 is that our existing computer system, the computer software we're using, was turned on in 1999, and the powers that be back then decided to backfill 5 years of data. So anything from 1994 to 1999 is backfilled. It's called a conversion. Prior to 1999, our coroner reports were paper. They were not automated. They were not in a computer system. So from moving from 99 forward, those are pretty good numbers that you can see up there. And interestingly enough, within the next 2 weeks, we here are having a brand new computer system installed, a very ambitious project that's costing several millions of dollars. And we hope to backfill all the statistics and information going back to 1991. So what I hope to do, maybe by the Scuba show in June, if I can crunch the numbers and do a little bit of homework, might have some better statistics on how many fatalities we've had going back to 1991, which represents, that's over 30 years of data. So it could be very interesting. I'm not sure you can generally glean anything from looking at those numbers. 5 tends to be the average number of fatalities we see. The heyday, so to speak, was like from 2009 to 2012. 2012, we had a total of 10 fatalities for no apparent reason. So we're just kind of paying attention to these numbers. In 2023, as far as I know, we haven't had any fatalities, and maybe we'll have another year 0. That would be fantastic. So crunching those numbers, going back all the way to 1994, we know we've had a total of 122 scuba-related fatalities in Los Angeles County. Better than almost 90% of them were male. The average age is about 43.8. The oldest fatality was a man who was 79, and the youngest victim was 14. We've had 2 14-year-olds as far as I know. And this is the thing that kind of jumps out to me anyway, compared to the DAN statistics. 45% have some medical component attributed to the death. And this is usually something we discover at autopsy. Again, looking at these numbers, 36 of those fatalities occurred on chartered dive boats. 22 occurred at Casino Point. 15 were supervised by an instructor, or there was an instructor basically at the side of the victim when the terminal event occurred or when the incident occurred. 9 of these cases were deemed to be natural causes. The person just happened to succumb to a naturally occurring disease while they were scuba diving. And one of those cases we're going to talk about tonight. That next bullet point I find very interesting, that we only see 4 cases where alcohol or illegal drugs was a factor in the cause of death. So given the propensity of our population to do things stupidly while under the influence of alcohol and drugs, I think that's a kind of a refreshing number to see that it's so low. 3 of these cases we left as undetermined. We could not come up with a informed medical opinion for the cause of death, and we can do that. At the end of the day, if the coroner has no informed medical opinion, despite all the testing, investigation, autopsy, toxicology, we can leave cases unknown, undetermined. 8 of those cases are skin divers or breath hold divers. I include those in the statistics because historically, when a skin diver dies, when they're engaged in that type of activity, it tends to have an impact on the overall scuba diving community per se. These are people that were actually breath hold diving for some purpose of either hunting for game or photography. They were wearing a wetsuit and had a weight belt, as opposed to someone who was just snorkeling off the back of their boat or snorkeling off the beach. I include those 8 just because I think there's some lessons learned there. 3 of these cases involved the diver using a rebreather. We've had so far a total of only 4 commercial divers, and those are actually divers who were engaged in some type of business or were hired to perform some tasks, not commercial divers in the sense that they were diving deep on a structure or a rig. Hard hat divers, these were people that were just engaged in some type of business. They were hired to perform a task using scuba gear. And the next bullet point, second from the bottom, I think is a really interesting one. Of all the cases we have here, we only found one where traumatic injuries contributed to the death. And it was actually a neck injury on a diver who was approaching a boat that was at anchor, and there was a lot of swell that day, and the diver got too close to the boat on the surface, and it came down on top of him like a fly swatter and had head and neck injuries. So I think that's a real interesting statistic, given the fact that scuba diving, we know you're entering a quote unquote environment that might have some hazards in it, including propellers and spear guns and anchors, sharp stuff, rocks. So only one fatality where there's some traumatic injuries. And then there was a case of, we did have a mine diver a number of years ago, kind of an interesting case. In the hills above La Cañada, there's some private property where there is a old mine shaft that at certain times of the year will flood with fresh water. And the person decided it would be a fun opportunity to go scuba diving into that freshwater mine, and unfortunately did not come out alive. I put this slide up because again, it's kind of a testament to, I think, of how truly, my humble opinion, how safe scuba diving actually is. I got this from a Men's Journal magazine from a number of years ago. Shows about the deadliest adventure sports, total deaths per 1,000 participants. Mountaineering or mountain climbing, summiting K2 in the Himalayas, of course, 104 people out of 1,000 won't make it. Base jumping, that's a pretty high risk, high intensity kind of activity. People jumping off of stationary objects with a parachute, 44 out of 1,000 are going to perish. And then they drop pretty significantly to only 3.3 while skydiving, 3.8 hang gliding. Then you get to ATV riding, scuba diving, and backcountry skiing and snowboarding. So on the lethality scale, if there is such a thing, scuba diving falls somewhere between riding an ATV and backcountry skiing or snowboarding, and that is backcountry, not skiing on the slopes, actually going backcountry. So I think it's interesting to note that. I know years ago, as a young scuba diver and starting my life trying to get life insurance, that was a hit you had to take. If you disclosed that you were a scuba diver, your life insurance policy, you had to pay a little extra premium for whatever reason. I don't know if it's that way today. All my life insurance is paid up. I don't need any more. Thank you. But that was something that people have to deal with. Another thing worth mentioning. Sorry, was there a question there? Somebody say something? No? Okay. Also wanted to mention a tool we have here at the coroner's office, which is kind of unique. We have a CT machine. computer tomography scanner, and it's kind of unique. The reason we have a CT machine, it was donated to us back in 2016 by the Rabbinical Council, and some other religious groups got together to help us when families are opposed to autopsy for religious reasons. The CT machine can help us grant that request. It helps us to rule out certain pathologies and certain injuries, makes it a little bit more palatable for us to agree to that request when it comes in. They're kind of expensive, but it was donated to us. Interestingly enough, CT machines used on cadavers or dead bodies, postmortem examination, is rather rare in the United States. There's only 4 places where you will find a CT machine being used for coroner or medical examiner work. There's us here in Los Angeles, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Baltimore, Maryland, and Dover Air Force Base. Those are the only 4 places in the United States that use a CT machine. And interestingly enough, it's much more common in Europe and Asian nations. They'll use a CT machine. It doesn't replace an autopsy, but it helps supplement some things. So that was the reason we got the CT machine. And one unintended benefit from that, it's not that glorious. It sits there in the truck in the parking lot. It helps us to identify some of the barotrauma and embolisms we have in scuba-related fatalities. The challenges with using a CT machine, quite frankly, doctors across the country, across the world, are trained in how to interpret a CT scan on a live patient. A CT scan of a dead body is not quite the same thing. The interpretation is different, and that can be very challenging if a doctor needs to go testify in court. So a lot of the legwork, a lot of the trailblazing, if you will, has kind of been done here in Los Angeles. We've sort of written the book on postmortem CT interpretation. We've found it a very helpful tool in looking for bullet fragments, finding other issues and diseases, but finding barotrauma or embolisms a little bit trickier at autopsy. What you can find is gas bubbles developing in the person's circulatory system post-mortem. It's occurring naturally. A little bit of decomposition, a little bit of fermentation in the blood can cause bubbles to spontaneously occur. And the challenge for our doctors, how do we tell the difference between a gas bubble that might have caused an injury or caused a fatality as opposed to a gas bubble in the circulatory system that was formed spontaneously or just came about because of good aggressive CPR and other resuscitative attempts. And the CT machine helps us make that differentiation. So, and that's what it looks like. So let's talk about some cases here. I've got 3 cases and a little bit of a caveat when we go into these 3. These are real incidences that did occur. 3 of them are from 2017. I don't know why I picked 2017, but I did. And just a little bit of fair warning. Some of these cases you may have seen before, maybe you read about them, or you might have independent knowledge of these. These might been people you know. These cases might have been occurred in front of you. You may have witnessed this. So, fair warning, I do take a little bit of poetic license with the factors and factoids of these specific cases. These are real cases, and the cause of death is that we're gonna talk about is the official cause of death, but some details I take some poetic license with. I will alter and change to protect the innocent, quote unquote. Some of these cases have been adjudicated, some of them have not, some of them may be under appeal. So if you see something there that you don't agree with, or you know for a fact is not completely correct, you're probably right. But please avoid the temptation later on when we go through questions to point out the error, because That's just me trying to be careful. So this case here, this is from August of 2017. What we have is a 58-year-old Caucasian female. She's 5 feet 1 inches and 125 pounds, and she's diving off of a chartered dive boat at Santa Barbara Island. This was a multi-day trip. Second dive of the second day of a 5-day trip. I believe the dive boat was out of Santa Barbara. The dive location was Arch Point, and reportedly this is near Brittle Star Reef, if that means anything to anybody. So she was diving with a buddy, a partner, it was her husband, and they were at about 63 feet. And for whatever reason, she became inverted because she had too much gas in the legs and feet of her dry suit. She was dry suit diving, and their total bottom time was 25 minutes. So what happened was she was still negatively buoyant, but the air collected at her ankles and her knees in the dry suit, and there was no way to vent it. So she was stuck upside down. So overinflated in a lay and still negatively buoyant, stuck to the bottom. Her partner assisted her while she was struggling upside down. And at some point she became unresponsive. Not sure if this is when a weight belt ditch occurred or not, but somewhere, a very dynamic situation. So when she was brought on board the boat, she was in cardiac arrest and CPR was started immediately. AED was used on the decedent and she was shocked 3 times. I'm pretty sure that, I don't know if it's standard or if it's a requirement, but I think just about all dive boats and everywhere you go nowadays do have AEDs, automatic defibrillators, on board and available to everybody. Sheriff's Air Rescue 5 responded out to Santa Barbara Island and transported her to the chamber at Catalina Island in full arrest. I think the story was she was brought on board the boat. The boat weighed anchor and started heading towards the chamber, and the helicopter met them between Santa Barbara Island and Catalina and took her the rest of the way. So she was placed in the chamber and compressed to 165 feet. She was pronounced dead in the chamber without ever regaining a pulse. So she was an experienced scuba diver. She had logged well over 1,700 dives. She had received her advanced diving certification around 2004. So about 13 years of advanced diving was her experience. She did have a redundant cylinder, a pony bottle, and still had air in it. There was no indication that there was an attempt to use it, and there was no indication that she actually went into an out of air situation. So 14 pounds of weight were ditched from her buoyancy compensator. And I think she was, so 120, I think she was 125 pounds. So she's on the slighter side. At autopsy, we saw 30% narrowing of the anterior descending branch of the left coronary artery. At the age of 58, 30% narrowing is not bad. We would all like to see ourselves have less hardening of the arteries, but that's not unusual. So the autopsy did reveal evidence of severe barotrauma with evidence of entrapped air within the lungs, skin, pericardium, brain, and the arterial system. And this, of course, was confirmed with the CT scan. Toxicology that we performed showed there was a therapeutic level of a antidepressant on board, and the equipment analysis showed there was no abnormalities or problems. This is what came out of her dive computer. And I can't remember if the blue line was her buddy or the red line was her, but that's basically both the divers. And you can kind of see they're kind of hovering at about 60 feet. And then at about 25 minutes into the dive, this is where she became inverted and stuck. So there was an emergency ascent to the surface, both of the divers at the same time. So the cause of death was determined to be barotrauma and drowning. So again, the CT machine was very helpful with this interpretation that we saw the different air bubbles in the different parts in the circulatory system, including the heart and the brain. So I think talking about this case over the years, what we were talking about is just her positioning of being upside down, head down, can cause a little bit of an arrhythmia, probably had some respiratory difficulty. I'm 58 years old, and I think if I was stuck upside down underwater for a while, I would probably have some issues, and I consider myself to be relatively healthy. So that was what led to her unconsciousness, and then brought to the surface in rescue attempt. That's when the barotrauma probably occurred. She was unconscious and going quickly that's the only way to save someone's life. That's where it occurred, but that would be an estimate. So we got 2 more cases. How are we doing on time, Ken? Is it okay to open up the floor for questions?
We can either do questions now about this specific case, or people can, I will do it the easy way. If you have a specific question about this case, just unmute yourself and fire away. I can see most people, but if not, we can move on and save them for later.
I do have one question about.
Go ahead, Lionel.
Yeah, drowning. It seems like you've never said anything about drowning. Did she lose her regulator in the process of ascent?
Yeah, I think that was. I'd have to look back at this case, but I'm pretty sure the regulator was out of her mouth in ascent. It's also worth mentioning, if I didn't say at the outset, but drowning. The diagnosis of drowning is also a very tricky thing for a pathologist to do, even with an autopsy. And you may be thinking, well, drowning, how hard could that be? That's slam dunk. All you have to do is open up the body and look at the lungs, and if you see fluid in there, well, that's drowning. And in all reality, drowning is far more complicated than just that. We know that about 30% of all drownings are dry drownings. And what a dry drowning is where a person will enter the water, they'll start to flounder, and a little bit of water starts to enter their airway, and the mammalian dive reflex kicks in. Your epiglottis shuts off the windpipe because water going into the lungs is bad. So it says, water going into the lungs bad, stop that, keep the water out. But the laryngospasm also occludes the airway, so no air gets in, so the person actually can suffocate without any water entering the lungs. Additionally, with good aggressive CPR, we can still see post-mortem at autopsy wet, heavy lungs that are full of fluid. And we have no way of determining if that was the water in the lungs is due to aggressive CPR or due to an actual wet drowning, which can happen where the person actually is ingesting and inhaling copious amounts of water into the lungs themselves. So what my pathologists tell me is there is no way to conclusively prove with an autopsy, there's no test we can perform post-mortem to prove that someone drowned. And that can get kind of tricky if you're dealing with a homicidal drowning or a suicidal drowning, and you may have to go testify. My doctors say that drowning is a finding of exclusion. We have enough information based on the witness statements, the terminal event, and we've ruled out every other possible explanation for why this person is drowned. We'll call it drowning. In a scuba diving situation, well, drowning is probably pretty reliable. You probably had some drowning going on there. Where it gets more interesting for us in the investigative field when you find maybe a juvenile in a bathtub or a juvenile in a toilet. What really happened there? Because at autopsy, we cannot prove that a drowning has occurred.
Okay,
John, maybe, and Dan, you may have a question, but maybe also mention that example you use at times of, I think it was the Joy Luck Club movie, and a drowning there.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, there's a movie called The Joy Luck Club. It got some critical acclaim back in the early 90s. And there is a scene there with if you haven't seen it, it's a good rental on Netflix. Sorry, it's a chick film. What can I say? But it's very interesting. It's a story about 4 Asian women and their relationships with their mothers and their history. And there's a scene in the Joy Luck Club where a young mother is giving a bath to an infant. And from a cinematography standpoint, what happens is she's bathing her child, and the child drowns in the bathtub, in the basin. And you're left to ponder the question based on the music and her eye contact and what she's saying. Did she do it? Now, that's the dramatic cinematography question, but from a forensic standpoint, that is probably the most accurate portrayal of a drowning that's ever been done on television or in the movie. So if you get a chance, look up the Joy Luck Club, because it's a very silent event. Ken and I do a drowning investigation class, a post-certified drowning investigation class for the Orange County Sheriff Coroner. And the 3 takeaways from that class that we put on for homicide detectives, Coast Guardsmen, deputy coroners, and pathologists, we say, number 1, drowning is a silent event. Number 2, a doctor doing an autopsy cannot prove that a drowning has occurred. And the third point is, please use all matter of subject matter experts when investigating a drowning. So yeah, check out the Joy Luck Club.
And the other thing to mention quickly is to touch on the idea of the silent drowning. And I want to say this was a 79-year-old guy, drowned or died at Casino Point, in front of probably 200 divers who were there, doing the normal thing, not too far from the steps, and nobody realized anything until somebody realized there were a pair of fins floating and there were feet in them, and the guy was upside down and basically at that point had died. So, the idea of the splashing victim calling for help and they drown simply doesn't comport with reality. Dan Ord, I see you're unmuted. Do you have something you wanted to add, Dan?
I apologize if I missed this, but was the decedent unresponsive before the rescue was started?
I think that's my understanding. When she was inverted and she was struggling, and her buddy was trying to attempt a rescue to right her or whatever, and I guess the situation was there was so much air by the ankles and the feet and the knees that this was just not going well at all. And it wasn't until she became unresponsive that there was an actual ditching of the belt and, okay, now we're going up to the surface. So I think that's why we sort of surmise it was just the physiological strain on the person being inverted is what caused her to lose consciousness. Now, is that when the drowning occurred, or was the drowning occurring on the way up? That's a tougher question to ask, or a tougher question to answer.
Well, also, were the 14 pounds all the weight she had?
As far as I know, yes.
Okay.
I think I've seen some dry suits with vents down around the ankles.
Yeah, I think Apollo suits
Yeah.
have that.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Good
And it's a
question.
lovely idea.
Okay, moving on. We got case number 2 here. This is from July of 2017. I dusted this one off just because it's kind of a very interesting one for me. This is a 57-year-old Filipina female who is diving on the UB-88. If you haven't heard of the UB-88, when you get a chance, Google it. That's a very interesting bit of history. The UB-88 is a World War I German submarine that is sunk somewhere off of San Pedro. The story goes behind the UB-88. At the conclusion of World War I, the United States Navy took over a number of the German ships, and a U.S. crew took the UB-88 on a whirlwind tour of the world, raising funds for war bonds. This is in the early 20s, and it made it all the way into Southern California waters. and it right around 1925 or 1926, I think, it was sunk as part of some naval exercises. It was used for target practice. Its whereabouts were unknown until relatively recently, somewhere around 2010 or 11, it was discovered. People knew it was out there all along, and they tried to find it. So if you are a technical diver and you're into that sort of thing, you can go dive on the UB-88. It is in 190 feet of water. When you Google it, there's some fantastic photographs of what it looks like underneath at the bottom. So this is a thing you can do, apparently. And so she went with a group diving with a dry suit off of a chartered dive boat. So this is a tech dive. This is 190 feet deep. She's diving with twin 130s, an extra 40 cubic foot, and a DPV scooter, DP, whatever those stand for. So she's had 10 years of diving experience with over 2,500 log dives. The deepest dive was to 200 feet. So she's had the training. She's got the right equipment. She knows her business. She's in a group with 3 other divers, 2 buddy teams of 2. And 12 minutes into the dive, I guess it takes 6 minutes to descend, and the plan was to spend 6 minutes on the bottom and then come back up. They noticed that she was no longer with them. They were all using scooters, and she was found unresponsive with her regulator out of her mouth. The regulator was caught on a fishing net. Apparently, this sunken submarine's got all manner of old fishing nets draped all over it. The other divers cut the net free of the regular, unclipped her 2 of the extra bottles, but they left the scooter attached, and she was sent up. So the plan, I guess, in this sort of a situation, if there was an emergency or whatever, the divers cannot go up with the victim. They have to do their decompression stops, otherwise they will be victims. So I kind of akin this to being, if you're into mountaineering and climbing on Everest, you kind of go into the death zone at some point if you're a climber, and if something happens, there is no rescue. Nobody has the ability to physically assist or help because of the working at these extreme depths. But apparently that was the game plan if something bad were to happen, and the topside crew on the boat said, well, if something happens, then they're just going to be sent free floating to the top, and hopefully they'll be able to do something about it. So she surfaced about 50 feet from this boat and spotted quickly. They got her out of her gear, brought her on board the boat, did full arrest, CPR was started, and it was about 25 minutes later that the buddies safely ascended because of all the decompression stops. She was eventually transferred by Coast Guard to the chamber on Catalina, compressed to 165 feet, but pronounced dead at the chamber. Autopsy revealed a 280-gram heart and 20% narrowing of the left and right coronary arteries. Given her age and size, that's okay. That's not bad. That's within the realm of being healthy per se. We did see subcutaneous emphysema of the chest, tympanic membrane perforation of the left ear on the external exam. We also saw some Hashimoto's disease, which is a thyroid condition, which was interesting, but really didn't have anything to do with the incident or the death. This is one of the few cases where our pathologist did note a tympanic membrane perforation of the left ear. That's a question we get an awful lot. Well, did the person have a squeeze, or did they blow out their eardrums? And most of the pathologists I talk to will say, I can't make a distinction whether if the person had an ear injury on descent or on ascent, or if this was postmortem or about the time of death. So most of our doctors don't go there, but in this case, the pathologist did look at the ears. Toxicology was negative. We did have a neuropathologist look at the brain and saw that there was hemorrhagic microinfarct seen as a subcortical white matter and brainstem are consistent with the gas air emboli. Again, our CT machine was very helpful in confirming all this. This is what her dive computer profile looked like. You can see a descent down there, and after about 6 minutes, she kind of flattened out there. It didn't seem any movement, and it wasn't until 10 minutes into the dive is when she was discovered, and that's when they cut her loose, and you see the rapid ascent to the surface. So the cause of death was determined to be drowning and air embolism. Now, Carl, I don't know if you had anything else to add on this one, just because it was sort of an interesting case, because I know it went to the chamber. And any other thoughts about the UB-88 or any other incidences out there?
No, I'm trying to remember the that case. I do remember it. I'm just trying to remember the specifics. And I know that there was an issue in terms of just response in terms of the diving accident, getting to her, getting her on the boat, and I'd have to check to see if this is the one where you got multiple agencies responding, and there's a lot of confusion in it. But there may have been two like that. But this one, if we'd had the whole information ahead of time, we probably would not have recompressed, because she went unconscious at depth, and that would have indicated that the problem probably wouldn't be air embolism, and that, just thinking about it, the gas in the vessels afterwards may have just been decompression sickness gases coming out of solution, as opposed to an actual pulmonary barotrauma rupture.
And John,
what-
can you
Go
go back? Go ahead, Dan. I'll get to me next.
Yeah, what gas mix was she breathing? Do you know?
I want to say, I thought I put it up here. I don't. Let's see. Is that the second boat? The second bullet point, 40 CF 50-50, 40 CF 100%. Does that mean anything to mixed gas people?
Well,
No,
the 50-50 would be a mixed gas.
Yeah, it's decompression gas, probably.
Yeah,
I don't know what the 100% is.
100% is probably O2.
Yeah,
That's
that
my
would be
guess.
decompression gas too.
Yeah.
And I think, if memory serves me right, I think all that was ditched when they attempted to rescue her. And I think the ESD divers went back the next day to recover her gear, including those bottles. And I'm not sure if they were successful or not.
Okay.
But I think that was just based on.
Okay.
I mean, my guess would be based on the depth. Can you back up one slide, John? The one before that?
Yeah, maybe Trimix.
Well, I was going to say my guess might even be air, that you've got twin 130s.
Yeah.
So you've got, twin 130s is 260 cubic feet of air. That's a lot of air. But again, you're going to use it up at that extreme depth. And that the 40 CF, so she's got that and 240 cubic foot bottles clipped to her. So the 40 CF 50-50 is for a decompression stop number one. This is out of my realm, but let's say that's at whatever, 60 feet. And that the 40 feet, 40 CF 100 feet is O2, and that's going to be probably around 20 feet or shallower. So my guess is they could have been doing the dive on air. It's too deep for nitrox.
That's a pretty deep dive on air, though.
It is. It is.
Just for somebody who's a technical diver.
Yeah. I don't know if we have any tech divers here or not. And Grant Graves is put a thing in the chat, and Grant is a tech diver. Given the year, it is likely trimix, could be air, unlikely other gases are clearly deco gases. So yeah.
Yeah.
And John, would you go ahead one slide to the profile? Maybe it's two slides. Because the thing I notice here is if you look at the way that graph goes, and so you have the 5-minute mark, the next hash is 7.5 minutes, and then the 10. So somewhere around 6.5 minutes or so, to me, that flat line is where you see the turn there and where it goes flat. That's probably where the regulator comes out of her mouth and she gets snagged. And now she's spending 4 minutes or thereabouts on the bottom, unconscious most likely. And again, if you remember, in terms of how long can we be without air, and it's not much of a problem, it's 4 to 6 minutes. So, it's a type of thing where, to me, I look at that profile and go, she may have been unrescuable by the time they got to her, which sort of dovetails a little bit on what Carl was saying, that a lot of time elapsed, and not blaming anybody, but just a lot of time elapsed before anything really happened. Just an observation more than anything else.
Yeah, and it's Grant.
Yeah, go ahead, Grant.
I think if you look at the little blip on the depth profile at about 5 minutes, that might have been when her rig got caught. She was DPVing, so moving fast.
Sure.
Likely ripped it out of her mouth. She may have aspirated in shock of that, and clearly didn't switch to her backup regulator. I'm assuming it's a typical tech rig, but we don't know, which means she had probably a lanyarded regulator around her neck that she could have easily gone to, but there were probably complicating factors that led her to go unconscious due to the loss of the regulator at high speed, and then clearly went unconscious and sunk to the bottom, hypothetically, of course.
Yeah. And again, that sinking to the bottom there, if you look at the depths, it's 180 feet, and I'm guessing that bottom line is no deeper than 190. And I've never dove. Have you dove the UB-88, Grant?
I have not.
Okay.
But
I'm
I've
just
dived
making.
quite a bit.
I
I
was
doubt
saying-
it's air given 2017. 2000 easily could have been air, and that could complicate her
Yeah.
recovering from the incident. But I highly doubt it's air in this day and age. I'm probably the only one that would do a profile of that type of depth given circumstances, but not typical anymore in the tech community.
But looking at that thing, and the only submarine I ever dove, I did dive the U-352 off of North Carolina, that I could see if you're towards the top of the wreck and you eventually go unconscious, that could just be you're rolling down the side of the wreck or something like that, now down into the sand, where then it goes flat, flat, flat. But also just hearing Dan, myself, Grant, Carl, and John mention all these things, just for the rest of you, it indicates the difficulty on our end analyzing this. There's a lot of, I'll call it educated guesswork that goes into this. And a lot of times we don't have definitive answers because so many of these accidents happen out of sight of any witness. And again, not blaming anybody, but it's the type of thing where you turn that way and your buddy was there and you turn back and they're gone. You never really saw exactly what happened. So sometimes it's really hard to piece together this stuff. And that's why sometimes with a lot of these accidents, there will be 3 or 4 different theories floating around, and they may all have, equal viability.
Yeah, and this was the case where there's like a single person on the boat that called for the rescue, and there are multiple transfers of the patient from who we have.
I take it you're looking at your actual notes there, Carl.
Yep.
Yeah.
Multiple transfers of care while heading back to the harbor and getting placed on the helicopter.
And to just kind of dovetail into what Ken was talking about, we're making assumptions or estimations, and this is something that is very challenging for me and my doctors and my investigators when we are dealing with families. They are looking for explanations, and I've been doing this a long time, and when you're dealing with grieving families, you kind of know the drill, so to speak, what to expect, how to explain things. But what I found over the years, for some reason, when you're talking about a scuba fatality, very difficult to deal with the survivors and the family members, even if the friends and family members are divers themselves. These cases have a tendency to show that families just cannot accept the fact that this is a horrible accident, that circumstances went beyond someone's control. There has to be an explanation as to why. And this turns into, unfortunately, a lot of cases of the blame game.
Yeah.
This person could not have perished scuba diving. They were such a good scuba diver. They were experienced. They never took chances. There has to be another reason. It must have been something with the gear or the buddy or the boat or the dive master. They are looking for something else. And that's a very hard thing for us to do. So we provide them with as much detailed information as we can and remind them that at the end of the day, we are expressing an informed medical opinion as to the cause and manner of death. And if they want more answers, or they ultimately looking to hold someone else accountable for this, it can be very unpleasant. And the best thing we can do is just provide all the information, all the evidence, be very professional, be as objective as possible rather than conclusive. And sometimes these matters are adjudicated in a civil arena, and they can get kind of unpleasant, particularly if you're the owner and operator of a dive boat or a dive shop, or you happen to be a buddy who didn't necessarily do anything wrong. But it's just an interesting observation that families, survivors, just can't seem to accept that this is an accident.
Grant, I see your hand is up. Is that a new comment or is that the old hand?
Sorry, Artifact.
That's okay. There we go. Anyone else have anything they'd like to ask about this? Or shall we
Just
move on to case three?
one other thing, Ken,
Yeah,
is
sure.
that John, pull up that profile again.
Coming up.
Yeah,
There
okay,
we go.
that's the profile if you take the data from the computer and go point to point. And Ken, if you could let me share my screen.
Yeah, give me a second.
Because this was a computer that recorded maximum depth every 20 seconds.
All right, Carl, go ahead, and I think it'll kick John's screen off for a
Yeah.
second.
Well, if you do that, I'm going to look for the Joy Luck Club video.
So this is what all you can tell from the profile is that the maximum depth that occurred in that 20-second period was that depth. And so down here where it's like this little glitch here, all it says is that the maximum depth at this point here was that depth. It wasn't necessarily something pulling them up for a second or so. We can't make an assumption like that. So all we can say is that the profile fell within these bars, and at some point during the 20 seconds hit that depth. And you can see down here, once they reached that maximum depth, they were steady. So there's no movement up. And so that's pretty much where you can say where she passed out, or even if she was tangled, you might be seeing movement up and down if you recorded more often, but always going back to the same depth. So that's
In other words, what maybe simplify a little bit what you're saying for anyone who's never seen it this way, Carl, if you take any one of those given bars within that 20-second interval, you could have been at 50 feet and then gone down to 180 feet, and all it would show you would be the 180 feet because it's taking the maximum depth of that 20-second interval, not
Right.
registering every single point every second.
right.
Cool.
All right.
Well, not cool, but you guys know what I mean. Tim, I see you've unmuted. Do you have something you wanted to ask?
Well, not ask, but although I've never dived that wreck, looking at that profile looks like what you would do on the San Francisco Maru in truck. Straight down on the deck at 170, and that's done on air or on the 23% nitrox, just to minimize the getting the nitrogen narcosis. And at that depth, she would have been nicely narked, particularly if she was on air. So if she snagged a regulator and lost it that way, the thought comes to me that might have had an effect on her ability to untangle the reg and get it back in her mouth.
Yeah, just in terms of that, the two of the buddies that we have dive computer profiles on, they were using Trimix 1845. I don't think we've got anything on her mix in what I've got here, but that's what the buddies had entered as their mix for this dive.
So you could assume that her mix was similar, if not the
Right.
same.
And that would make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else have anything they'd like to add, chime in or ask? All right, John, you can go back and do your share screen again, and off we go to number 3.
How are we looking? Got me?
You look great, but there we go.
Okay.
Because you look great, but we got no share screen.
Okay.
We're good to go.
Okay. So this will be the last case for this evening. This is in September of 2017. And we have a case of a 60-year-old Caucasian male. He's diving at Isthmus Cove. He's 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighs 197 pounds. He's on his third dive of the day, the night dive. I guess the 2 previous dives were during daylight hours. And this is from a chartered dive boat. I presume this is opening night of lobster season. And he's diving with his son. They made it to 107 feet for 10 minutes. And then they came shallow to 40 feet. And then came to the surface, and he was heard coughing loudly, and went to a nearby private boat. I guess it was kind of crowded at Isthmus Cove, opening night of lobster season. Waved his dive light, indicated he was in distress, and there were 2 private citizens on this privately owned vessel. Brought him aboard, immediately became unresponsive. I guess there was a quick distress call made, and fishing game was already out there, and they were the ones that responded and took him to the chamber on their boat. Placed into the chamber, compressed 165 feet, and was eventually pronounced dead there. He was diving with about 35 to 45 pounds of lead. I think he had a wetsuit on. So we were estimating that he's probably anywhere from 13 to 23 pounds overweighted. Medical history included atrial fibrillation, and he had a cardiac ablation 2 months prior. At the age of 60, as long as he got a clean bill of health from his doctor. Generally speaking, if you have atrial fibrillation, that's not necessarily a lethal condition, but anyone who's diagnosed with that is at a very high risk of stroke. Autopsy revealed he had 20 to 60% stenosis of the mid-left anterior descending artery, and his heart was 400 grams. That's outside the normal realm. Should be closer to 300 grams. He also showed an enlarged liver and an enlarged spleen. And this comes right out of the pathologist's opinion. His report said, hypertensive cardiovascular disease or high blood pressure is a common cause of atrial fibrillation. The increased strain on the heart by elevated blood pressure causes it to enlarge and is a risk factor for an arrhythmia, as well as a stroke. It is likely that the decedent sensed he was not feeling well due to the atrial fibrillation. After a period of time, this atrial fibrillation evolved into a lethal heart rhythm and sudden death. So this was a case we closed out as natural causes, just happened to occur while he was scuba diving. And this is a case where, depending on the doctor who does the autopsy and the opinions that are shared, this could have gone the other way. I've seen cases where the doctor will give an opinion that, well, because of the immersion in the cold water and the stress and being depth, that would contribute to the arrhythmia or the medical condition, and therefore this is an accident. It can go either way. It's a wobbler. A much more common scenario we're faced with every day in Los Angeles is, and very similar to what we're dealing with here as a judgment call, a you can have a minor traffic accident occur where a vehicle comes in contact with another vehicle. No airbags are deployed. It's a minor accident, and the elderly driver exits the vehicle, shakes their fist at the other driver, and then clutches their heart, collapses, and dies from a cardiac event. Now, is that a case of natural causes, or is that an accidental death? That is a wobbler. Doctors will go in either direction. Some doctors will say, no, that's an elderly person. They had a significant cardiac history. It was merely interesting where it occurred. This is a strictly naturally occurring event. Other doctors will say, but for the incident, the traffic accident, even though there was no trauma, the stress and strain of having this incident occur was enough to trigger the cardiac event, and therefore this is an accidental death. And that creates all kinds of interesting issues with insurance companies and families, but that is not uncommon. That's why I said at the beginning, our job is to come to an informed medical opinion as to the cause and manner of death. And it can sometimes be a little bit on the subjective side.
Was there any gas in circulation?
On this case, I don't think it was an out of air situation.
Oh, no, I mean, any gas in his bloodstream? Because being a third dive of the day, especially the third dive being 107 feet.
Yeah, we didn't see anything with the CT scan. And again, this was our doctor's opinion that he just, at the 400-gram heart and all these other conditions that were going on, that's probably what contributed. And he made it to the surface and was heard coughing forcefully. So.
And Dan, when you're asking about gas in the system, you're thinking like embolism type gas, or
No, I'm thinking about DCS.
just DCS? Yeah.
Yeah. And that, again, that's a really, and obviously he was, there was CPR involved, and that can create bubbles in the bloodstream. And if we can't get to the body, even if it's taken into refrigeration, maybe 2 or 3 days after death has occurred, you can still have air bubbles forming spontaneously in the bloodstream just through normal decomposition. How can we tell? It's not slam dunk. We're still writing the book on that issue, so to speak. Other things that can happen, our doctors are very good at. You can have a person, after they die, some time passes, blood sugar will start to spontaneously ferment, and you might have a false positive blood alcohol level. A number of years ago, there was a very high-profile drowning up at Lake Piru in Ventura County. Maybe you heard of it. It was an actress from the TV show Glee.
Oh, yeah.
She went out on a porch boat with her little boy, and they found the little boy on the porch boat, but they didn't find her. And he was about 4 years old and couldn't give a good history. Big response from local sheriff's dive teams to find her, and they didn't find her until about 4 or 5 days later. And when the autopsy report came out, she had a blood alcohol level of 0.06. And local media made a huge deal about that, saying, oh my God, she was boating intoxicated and she brought her little boy. And cooler heads prevailed and said, no. She was in the water for about 5 days. So a professional toxicologist, pathologist could testify that no, that blood alcohol level is consistent with a person not being found for 4 or 5 days. The blood sugar is spontaneously fermenting. Just as an example of some of the challenges we have when investigating not just scuba fatalities, but drowning accidents and things that happen in the water.
Captain, do you have any information about the last case's diving experience?
I don't think so. I didn't put it up there. Sorry to say, I don't know how experienced he was, but he was diving with he's 60 years old and he was diving with his son. So I presume his son was also an adult So anyway, any other questions about any of this stuff? That's my information up there. If anyone wants to get a hold of me or would like to ask me anything privately, your local coroner is accessible to you, not just as a diver or a member of the diving community. If you have a question about something else, a case, coroner reports, autopsy reports, our work product is in the public realm. It's not confidential. Death certificates are public documents. So when a person passes away, a certain amount of their privacy goes with them. So if you need information about a death, you can obtain it through normal channels.
Well, and also you have a searchable database.
Yes.
If you go
And
on the,
hopefully it's getting better.
if you go on the coroner website and type in Michael Jackson, and you will get you won't get the full report, but you'll get just a thumbnail of what the conclusions were and some of the other facts and stuff like that. And that applies to anybody who had an autopsy that was done under the jurisdiction of the coroner. How far back does that stuff go, John? Do you know offhand?
Right now, it's going back to 1994. It could go back, I said, with this new system, it could start looking like as far back as 1991.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, coroner reports do exist in perpetuity. We have some of the really old records from the 1800s are still in-house. They're official. They were handwritten in a big book. And back in right around the 1860s or 70s, you start thumbing through these official ledgers and you see interesting things like person fell off of horse and buggy. And that's all there is for the coroner's inquest.
So if I want to get Marilyn Monroe's autopsy and then read it over by her grave at Pierce Brothers Westwood, I could do that, right?
Absolutely. You don't
Okay.
have to show a need to know basis. You do not have to show a relationship to the deceased. Coroner reports, autopsy reports are public documents. The logic behind that is that lawmakers, legislatures, people long time ago decided that the public's need to know about what people are dying from outweighs that person's right to privacy and that family's right to privacy. Take it or leave it. You can agree or disagree with that, but that is how the rules and regulations are written. You can obtain that information.
I mean, and then for what it's worth, any of the reports I've written for the coroner, I like the idea, and you know this when you're writing them, that it is public information because, you know, I've always felt part of the education process in scuba diving is we need to know as a diving community what happened, what went wrong, and try to look at it as best you can, cold hard facts. And so, you know, there are other agencies that when they write their reports, they, you know, sort of like that last scene in the original Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Ark of the Covenant being taken back into a warehouse full of things that a lot of people aren't going to have access to. So I think it's a great thing that it is made publicly available. And as John's last slide says, let's be careful out there.
Good. Well, thank you.
Good. John, if you would stop your share screen, we can do any other general questions that anyone has. I usually get to do the first one, although we've answered a bunch. Tim will get. Oh, Tim's clapping. We have to do the applause as well. Is there anything with a scuba fatality? Is there anything done in the autopsy that is not done in a not scuba autopsy, or the other way around, anything that can't be done because it's a scuba autopsy?
Well, generally speaking, we're going to probably do a full autopsy, and there are occasions where families will, you know, be opposed to autopsy for religious reasons. And one case comes to mind where the family was opposed to an autopsy. We granted that request. make a long story short, the victim was in under the direct supervision of an instructor. And it was a few years later that the family decided, well, I guess they'll sue the instructor, but there was no autopsy to back up a lot of things. So it got kind of messy. But generally speaking, we have different levels of autopsy based on the case, what we're looking for, how do we proceed. And the scuba fatality will get a full autopsy because of the things I mentioned, the complexity of drowning physiology and the likelihood that we are probably going to have to go testify someday about the cause and manner of death. So we're going to be very thorough. Neuropathology, to have a neuropathology consult to actually look at, the brain. We're going to have to remove the brain, so that entails a complete dissection. So I want to say that the vast majority of scuba fatalities, you're going to get a complete autopsy. Other cases, the only thing that might affect that decision is, let's say you have an incident where a diver might be injured, transported to a local hospital, and may linger there for several days, if not weeks, before they finally succumb to their injuries. That's kind of rare, but it can happen. If a person's been to a hospital, they were treated, we've got good medical records, we know what they were diagnosed with, an autopsy is not going to help us too much. So we'll probably not do much of an autopsy in those types of cases. And admittedly, a lot has to do with the doctor who is specifically assigned on what they want to look for and how they want to proceed. If you look at some of the older textbooks about how doctors and pathologists should do an autopsy on a scuba case or a scuba fatality, some of these old textbooks say, well, you need to immerse the entire body in a vat of water, and as you cut, look for bubbles coming up through the water. And of course, that's just not done anymore. No one's really interested in doing that whatsoever. But we're so to answer your question, I wouldn't say that there's really anything more or less done on a scuba fatality. It's very case specific, including the age of the person and other medical conditions. Needless to say, full toxicology is very important. The additional thing we screen for on a scuba case in the toxicology room, we do look for carbon monoxide. That's not something we'd normally look for in just a standard case, but that's something additional that has to be done. I'm not aware of any bad gas cases we've had per se over the years where carbon monoxide was a factor. But that's something we definitely check for.
Anyone else have any questions or anything they would like to add, either by, you can use your actual hand or the raise hand icon. That one's always so much easier.
Yep. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, Glenn's got his hand up. I can always count on Glenn. Unmute yourself, Glenn. There you go.
One thing to keep in mind is that we're all going to die, and we can't breathe air underwater. So, it's even though it's amazing how few people die from scuba diving, accidents or otherwise, bottom line, we can't breathe underwater, and we're all going to die sometime.
And to be clear, we can't breathe without a regulator in our mouth.
Well, yes, we can't breathe water. Let's say
there
that,
we go.
right?
There we go. That's a more accurate way to look at it.
Can't breathe it more than once.
That's true. That's true. Unless you're like Ed Harris in The Right Stuff, breathing the liquid oxygen, and not the abyss. That's where it was, the abyss.
That happened.
Any other questions or anything John, Mr. Lum?
Good evening. So I have a question, John. What is the origin of the title Coroner?
the origin of the word coroner, it's actually very interesting. The word coroner comes from the old, I say the old days of jolly old England. Our legal system and a lot of our things that are here in the United States were imported from England when the colonies came over. And interestingly enough, back in the days, the old days in England, the three most popular or the three most powerful people in the kingdom, apart from the king, were game wardens, sheriffs, and coroners. They were the enforcers. They were the local arm of the king. And back in those days, nobody really had any private property. Everyone was the king's loyal subjects. So when you died, your chattel, your stuff, whatever it is you had, did not go to your heirs. It went to the crown. And the king had his person in charge of that was called the crowner. And over the years, the term crowner evolved into coroner. It technically means the power of the crown. And as I said, back in those days, game wardens, sheriffs, like the Sheriff of Nottingham, and the coroners were the three most powerful people there were, because game wardens were responsible for game, food, so people could survive. The sheriff kept law and order, and the crowner or coroner was in charge of the dead bodies, but primarily went into the kingdom when someone passed away and collected everything for the king. And so those three people had to keep each other in check. That was a system of checks and balances between the sheriff, the game warden, and your local coroner. And that translated or evolved and imported to the United States that same system. Game wardens are still around, but they don't have that much power anymore. But if you look at the rules and regulations here in California, you have a sheriff and you have a coroner. And the highest law enforcement agent in the county, any county of California, is in fact the coroner, not the sheriff.
So
if
how
the
do you like
sheriff
that?
gets in trouble or breaks the law, technically the coroner trumps the sheriff. Believe it or not. I think that answers your question about the term coroner. Maybe answers your question.
Yes, it does. I was wondering though, how do you like that power?
I like it just fine. Now, when our previous Sheriff Baca, got into a little bit of trouble and got arrested, that was on federal charges. So the feds came in and got him. But technically, the coroner is in that hierarchy of authority, actually is higher than the local sheriff, believe it or not.
Mhm.
But yeah, look up the word crowner next time you're online. It'll give you the full story. Rather interesting.
Thank you for that.
And leave it to John to get that English connection in there. Anyone else have any questions that want to go? All right, then let's give a warm Zoom Seekers thank you to Mr. Kades for a very informative and enlightening presentation. I'll put in the commercial plug and remind you that on June 3rd, which is Saturday, at the Scuba Show, 4:00 in the afternoon, John and I and Carl remotely by videotape, because he won't be in town, we will be doing the annual Why Divers Die panel. It's usually one of the better attended ones in one of the big rooms down there. We'll cover some of the stuff we went through tonight, but specifically, we'll talk about any of the fatalities. There were 2 from calendar year 2022. So if you're at the Scuba Show, 4:00 Saturday afternoon, you do need to have one of the seminar bracelets, but we hope you'll join us for that. Next month on Zoom Seekers, we go artsy fartsy, and one of our local artists, Stephen Holman, who is a contributor to some of the prizes that you have at Chamber Evening. He does a lot of marine related artwork and stuff like that. he will be our guest speaker, talking about what inspires him and how he comes up with some of the various paintings that he does. So hopefully you'll join us for that, and that will be in May after Chamber Day, which is, when is Chamber Day? Oh yeah, May 3rd. So, www.chamberday.org. We're happy to take your donations for that as well. So with that, I think we'll call it a night. Again, John Kades, thank you very much. Thank you, Dan, Carl, and Grant, and others who chimed in with opinions and stuff. We appreciate you guys joining us every month for Zoom Seekers, and we will hope to see you again next month.